Welcome to Orensha Tech's PowerShell series. In this video, we're going to go over remotely running commands on other computers. Not only is it possible to run commands from your computer on another computer, it's possible to run that same command on multiple computers right from your computer. This is an awesome tool in PowerShell and one that really levels up your game as a system administrator. This technology is known as remoting. And one really cool thing is that the commands don't even need to exist on your computer for you to run them on the other computers. So you can install all the modules that you need on your servers and then run the commands in those modules from your computer without ever having to download those modules on your own computer. So again, super powerful and something you're definitely going to want to learn here. And just to break that down of how that's working, you're taking the commands and sending them over to the network. The receiving computer takes the commands and runs it via the PowerShell application installed on that computer. So let's look at how this works on both Windows and Linux and macOS. On Windows, we're using what's called Web Services for Management, or WSMan, and it's using a background service called Windows Remote Management, or WinRM. It is included by default on Windows 10 and Server 2012 and up, but it is disabled by default, and you just have to enable it if you want to start using it. Now on Linux and macOS, we're just using SSH, and that is usually going to be the Open SSH standard. So fairly simple on Linux and macOS, and again, even simpler to start using cross-platform technologies, so you can run commands from your Windows computer on your Linux servers or macOS machines. It's all going to be very versatile and cross-platform. Next, let's go over exactly what's happening when we run those commands on the remote computers. So the objects are returned over the network, but there's a key difference in the objects that are returned from the remote computer to your computer. They aren't one-to-one copies of the objects that were on that remote computer. And what's happening is a process called serialization and deserialization. So PowerShell takes those objects and converts them into an XML format that holds almost all of the properties for the objects. But what is lost is a lot of the methods. So once the objects are returned from the remote computer to your computer, you lose a lot of those functionalities that are built into the objects, like killing a process, but you do receive all of the information that was in the properties. But again, it is important to note that those are point-in-time representations of the objects that were on the remote computer. So we do have some limitations. There are ways to get around those limitations, but effectively, this is still so powerful, and it's going to be awesome to add this to your toolkit. So what is exactly needed to start remoting? Well, you need at least 2 computers with PowerShell 7.1 or up. And ideally, both of those computers are going to be on the same domain. But if they're not, there are ways to work around it. It's not the end of the world. It just makes it super simple if they are on the same domain. And if you don't have 2 computers, you can always set up remoting on your own computer and then use localhost to simulate remoting from one computer to another. You're not actually remoting because it's the same computer, but the techniques are going to be the same, so you can at least start learning and understanding the process. I will say that you can always get VirtualBox installed on your computer and then spin up a Linux server. It's all free, so that's a great technique, and I do recommend that that's what you do. Install VirtualBox, make your own server, and then you can practice remoting for real. And I do think that Amazon still has a free virtual machine in the cloud when you sign up for their Amazon Web Services. So that could be something to check out too, to get yourself a remote machine to start using remoting with. But again, if you can't do any of that, you can always resort to just setting up remoting on your own computer and using localhost. All right, so let's jump into setting up remoting on a Linux machine. I'm going to open up my Linux machine here, and on this machine, since I already had remoting set up, I just created another virtual machine with a new instance of Linux so that we could set up PowerShell remoting fresh. So this is what I'm recommending that everyone do if you don't have another machine. Just get VirtualBox on your Windows or your Linux machine and create yourself a virtual machine instance. So the first couple commands that we're going to be running are going to be setting up OpenSSH on your Linux machine. The first one here is going to be installing the clients. And then the second one is going to be installing the server. Now, I'm not going to show you how to set up this on a macOS machine, but I will give you the commands down in the description of the video so that you can at least see what those commands are. All right, now that we've got OpenSSH installed on this Linux machine, we're going to hop into PowerShell. So you do need to have PowerShell already installed on the machine. And if you need to know how to do that, you can hop back to our first video, which is going to show you how to install PowerShell on Windows, Linux, and Mac. But to get to PowerShell right from the command line of Linux, you just type in PowerShell. There we go. We're in our PowerShell command line, and we can run our PowerShell commandlets. And the next one we're going to want to run is going to be enabling the remoting tools. Okay, and then next we're going to hop back out of PowerShell into the Linux command line. And to do that, we just run exit. All right, next we're going to add the firewall rule that's going to allow SSH through the firewall on this computer. Now that we have that rule in, we'll be able to remote into this computer using SSH. All right, next we're going to enable SSH remoting using the enable SSH remoting commandlet. And this is awesome because it does all of the underlying work for you to set the SSHD config file to all of the necessary components that you need. And then the last thing to do is to restart the SSH service. So we'll hop back out of PowerShell using the exit command and run sudo service SSH restarts. All right, we're going to open up our SSHD config file just to show you a few things and where that file is located in case you ever want to go and change any of these settings. So we'll open up that file with nano in our file path here. And then our file name of sshd underscore config. And we use sudo to open up this in admin so that we could change it. And then we can see here a few of the main settings are going to be the public key authentication. So you can set this up to authenticate only using public and private key authentication, which is the recommended standard right now. But we are going to just use password authentication for now since these are all test environments. So here we have password authentication and it's got our hashtag in front. So if we just delete that hashtag, it uncomments this portion and it's going to turn on password authentication so that we can remote into this computer using just the password of our user instead of having to use public authentication. And then the next piece to look at here is the subsystems. So right now we have a PowerShell subsystem and a SFTP subsystem. Best practice is to turn off everything that you're not using. So I'm just going to comment out the subsystem for SFTP just so that it's not there since we're not using it. And then we will exit and save, overwrite that. And we have our config file set up the way that we want to use it. And go ahead and make those changes for your test environment so it's easier and you can follow along with this video. All right, next we're going to go over setting up SSH on Windows. Now I've got my other Windows machine here, remoting into this, and we'll set this up fresh on this computer. So we'll open up PowerShell and we'll open up this as an administrator. And then we're going to run a couple commands to do the same thing we just did on Linux and install the OpenSSH client and OpenSSH server. All right, now that that's installed, let's do the server. All right, after that's done installing, we're going to start the SSHD service. And then we'll set the service to automatically start. All right, once we've done those, we'll confirm that the firewall rule is set up. So we can see here that the firewall is going to allow SSHD through so that we can remote into this computer on our other computer. And then the last thing we'll do is change some of those configurations in the SSHD config file. So like we did with the Linux SSHD config file, we're going to go and turn on password authentication by removing the comments. And then for this one, we actually have to add in the subsystem for PowerShell. So we'll scroll down and we can see that the subsystem for SFTP is on. So we'll comment that out. And then we will put in our subsystem for PowerShell. And I'm just going to copy and paste this in here and we'll look at it. So we've got the subsystem PowerShell with the path to PowerShell. And just like we had set up on Linux, we're just setting up a subsystem for SSHD to connect to. And then we will lastly restart our service. And that finalizes the process for setting up SSHD on a Windows machine. And this could replace the WinRM system that Windows has, but generally you're not going to do that. This is purely to have communication between a Windows system and a Linux system. So let's go over how SSH works. As you saw, we had to put in our subsystem for PowerShell. So SSH allows multiple subsystems, and the other one you saw there was SFTP, but there are a wide array of different subsystems you can attach to the SSH listener. And you can even scale this up to having 100 or more endpoints within your SSH service. And this works by having your SSHD listener sitting on the computer listening for network traffic on a certain IP address and port number. And then whenever it finds that, it will route that traffic to the right subsystem. In this case, we're using that PowerShell subsystem. So just a little bit of the backend on how SSH is working. Next, let's dive into how Windows Remote Management works. And remember that this only needs to be set up on computers that receive commands. So you don't need to set it up on your computer if all you're going to be doing from that computer is sending the commands. But generally, you're just going to set up this on all of the computers. And some companies may not like this approach, but in the end, we went over security, and limiting these kinds of things just gives you a false sense of security, because if you're allowing anyone to run something at an administrative level, then you're already putting yourself at risk. So turning on some of these PowerShell features isn't really opening that much risk, and it's providing you a lot more benefit that outweighs some of that risk. And you're just going to search for other ways to mitigate that small risk that you are creating, which is going to be a better threat management than trying to just stop PowerShell altogether. So back to WinRM, it works in a similar way as SSH. It's going to have different subsystems that you can attach to it. And you can even break this down to have different subsystems that are only allowed to be connected to by certain users. And you can even break that down further by only allowing certain commands to be run on that subsystem. So as a system administrator, you could set this up to where your help desk could run a certain grouping of commandlets on all of the computers. And then you could have a different subsystem for your administrators that are going to be a lot more in-depth and capable, because you know that the administrators are a smaller group with a lot more security awareness and potentially more layers of security added on to their accounts, which should be the standard for your high-profile accounts. And WinRM does work the same way as SSH in that it has a listener on the computer listening on a certain port and IP address for the traffic, and then it takes that and routes it to the correct subsystem. And enabling WinRM is super simple on your Windows machines. It's just going to be one command that does all of the work for you. So we'll hop over to our Windows machine that we were setting up SSH on, and we'll enable Windows remoting as well. So this command is going to be enable PS remoting. So just like that, we enabled the WinRM system. It put in the firewall rules, and all of the underlying system configurations that you need to make is all done with that one command. And one thing to be aware of is that you do need to make sure that your computer's network is on the private profile for those firewall rules to be enabled effectively. And if you are approaching this from a system-wide lens, you can always deploy this with the GPO. So there's lots of options, and you should consider enabling this on all your computers, or at least on the computers you know that this is going to be something that is effective and beneficial for your system administration. All right, let's go over remoting and go over some of the concepts behind remoting and how you're going to be using it. The first approach is the one-to-one approach. And with this method, you don't need to be worried about the serialization and deserialization of objects, because effectively, when you use this method, you're going to be running commands directly from the computer. And the second approach is a one-to-many approach. So you run one command on many computers. All right, let's look first at that one-to-one and how we accomplish this. This is done using a command called enter PS session. And the first couple parameters that we're really going to want to understand is the difference between host name and computer name. So the host name parameter is going to equal Linux machines, and the computer name is going to equal Windows machines. More specifically, this is actually just applying to SSH and Windows Remote Management. So if you did have SSH enabled on your Windows machine, you would want to use the host name parameter. But the general way to look at it is host name is your Linux or macOS machines, and then computer name is going to be your Windows machines. So jumping back to our enter PS session command, we'll first look at starting a session with the Linux machine. So we'll use our host name parameter with our computer name and then the username we want to authenticate with. And then it will ask for our password because we did use the password authentication on the SSHD config file. And then once we're authenticated, we can see that we are in this remote computer by this beginning part right here. So now, like I said, we are effectively running commands on this computer and seeing the outputs from those commands in our computer. But the objects that we're seeing are on the other computer. They're not really being passed over the network. That is the case for our other method, which we'll go over in just a little bit here. And then another thing to note is that we are using this user's authentication and permission level for any of the commands that we do run. Although if we were connected to the domain and we were just using domain accounts, you'd be running your own permission level. So that's why domain is preferred. But of course, if we're just testing like we're doing here, this is a great way to get familiar with the processes and understand how remoting works. And then to exit out of the session, we just run the command exit PS session. But of course, if we forget to do that and we close out of the window and out of our PowerShell session, then it's going to be smart enough to know to close that session. And then one last thing about the one-to-one to be familiar with is session chaining. So if we were to enter into our PS session here on this table 1 computer and then enter into another PS session on another computer, we'd create a chain of PS sessions, and that can get really confusing. So it's something to avoid if you can, although it may be necessary in scenarios where you need to get past a firewall. For instance, you need to remote into a computer on one portion of the network, and once you're there, you can actually get to another portion of the network, which you couldn't get from your original computer. So it does have its uses. It's just something to be familiar with and avoid if you can. All right, next let's go into the one-to-many method of remoting. The commandlet behind the basis of one-to-many remoting is invoke command. And let's look at an example of one of these commands. So it has the same computer name and host name parameters to be familiar with, but the difference here is that you can specify a list of computers. So say we had computer 1, computer 2, and computer 3. For instance, if these were a bunch of your servers that you wanted to run the same command on. And then we'll go to our next parameter, which is script block. So this allows us to specify a command, and you can get as big as you want with this command, but it does have to fit inside of these brackets, and it can get a little muddy if you create a big script. So there is a second parameter called file path, and this is what you'd use if you already had a script on your computer. You could use this parameter to grab that script and then run it on the computers here that you're specifying with the computer name parameter. But we're not going to use that in this example. We're just going to use script block because it's a pretty simple command there. And then lastly, you'd specify your username. Of course, if you were on the domain, this would default to your username and this would work. But this is just a good example to point out all the different parameters that are commonly run with the invoke commandlet. So some other things to be aware of with the invoke command is that you can run commands simultaneously on up to 32 computers. After this, it starts queuing up those commands, and as one finishes, the next one will go. You can change this with the throttle limit parameter, but you do need a little bit more beefy computers and network in your environment to handle increasing your throttle limit. For the most part, 32 is going to be a good number. Just going to queue up anything after that. And then the next thing to be very familiar with invoke command is that these objects that are returned to your computer are the serialized and then deserialized objects. So this is that true. So anything run here in our script block is being sent back over the network to our computer. So it's going to take get process and run it on computer 1, computer 2, and computer 3 and send back the results from all three of those computers to our computer over the network. So it's going to lose a lot of those methods, but it will retain some of those built-in methods like toString. So not all of the methods are going to be gone, but all of the ones that apply to the objects themselves are going to be stripped away, and you're just going to be left with the properties and the data using that point in time concept. Again, this is still super powerful and allows you to collect large amounts of data from your environment quickly and process all of that data singularly on your own computer. Although I will leave off on the concept of filtering left, it still applies here. You're going to want to filter as much as you can on these computers that you're initially running the commands on so that less data is being passed over the network back to your computer. So always try to filter as early on as you can. It's going to make your life easier, and it's also going to reduce that bandwidth and the computer processing once you have that data back on your computer. And that wraps up our lesson on remoting. I hope you enjoyed it, and watch out for our next video where we're going to go over background jobs. Until then, thanks for watching and have a nice day.